Jeff Tsai, Forte Swordplay. So today we have a bit of a different kind of video for you. We're going to talk about toys. In fact, particularly one toy, which really is not a toy. This is an actual antique sword, something that is referred to commonly as Dussack or Dussack from the late 1500s. As someone who's been doing swordsmanship for the better part of 20 years, I would not consider myself a historian. I consider myself a student of history. I think one of the greatest things about HEMA is the H part of it. My expertise tends to be more in martial application, mechanics, understanding how all the body elements kind of work with the weapon. And because of what I do, I've had the privilege over the years to actually, on occasion, handle antique arms and sometimes actually acquire them. So this is something that I've currently got in my collection, which may change in the next little bit, but while I have it, I wanted to kind of share it with people. And so in a little bit, we'll actually kind of really focus on the weapon, kind of look at the little details. And I'm going to speak in terms of my experience with sort of like handling the weapon. How does the weapon handle? But I've got my colleague here, Alex, who will introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Alex, as I often go on the internet, Apprentice Alex. I'm a full-time bladesmith specializing in not quite historic reproductions. I refer to it as anachronistic reproduction. So I really closely study historic profiles, balance, weight, everything about the historical stuff, and then I kind of give my own spin on it. But because I have that research and the experience of making things, the kinesthetic side of creating arms and armor, mostly arms, I haven't done a lot of armor, it's all, it gives me a unique insight into how this may have been built and the way that things were constructed. And I think that the kinesthetic side of things, the handling side of things of these historical arms is super important. For me, I'm not as concerned about recreating an exact piece that's sitting in the Wallace collection aesthetically. I'm interested in creating something that handles that same way, that somebody can pick it up and have the same point of balance, the same weight that they might of a given piece out of one of those ancient collections.
Same sort of experience physically.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So yeah, you're my kind of person.
Yeah, and I've been doing martial arts since I was very young and stumbled into Forte through someone who cross-trained with the SCA a few years ago, and been loving it here.
Yeah. And so now Alex is our resident blacksmith, swordsmith, all things Smith related. So in a minute, I'm sure you guys don't really want to spend the video looking at us. You want to look at this. So before we hop off camera and really focus on this, just a couple of, again, just handling things. So one of the points I really want to make is that a lot of people, when they look at swords, particularly historical pieces or swords in general, they tend to kind of look at the sword in this kind of fashion, sideways, what is the shape of it, etc. And from my experience, the same weapon that looks a certain way in terms of a shape can handle in very different ways depending on how it's constructed. So looking at this, it's very difficult to tell how something handles just from looking at this way. Often, one of the things that you want to look at is actually looking at the sword this way, right? Really kind of looking at the thickness of the blade. We'll talk about things like distal taper. All of those things then affect things like handling. So there's this technique, a moulinet is what it's known as in the saber world. So these sorts of things where you're rolling the wrist, actually really important for studying swordsmanship in general, and not all swords really handle the same way. So this particular item, you can certainly do a moulinet with it, but it's going to fatigue the wrist for sure, right? Especially when you're doing some of the moulinets where you're really doing the really supinated kind of positions. So this to me feels like, if I'm going to do a moulinet, I'm going to actually use it in order to actually facilitate the cut on the other side. So parry and then a really nice, good, strong, cut. This feels kind of really solid in that sense. It really wants to cut, You can definitely flip into that parry and then cut afterwards. So you can definitely do it, but just as much doing these more standard sort of static parries, this also feels really, really good for that kind of purpose. So yeah, those are just a couple of the handling characteristics. And now we'll give you a couple of close-ups on the weapon. All right, here we go. So we're going to do some close-ups on this. And actually, before we get into the Dussack itself, I have another piece here. This is also from auction, a so-called Dutch claywang. And also another fun thing that we can kind of talk about another date. But like these are both things that, you know, from the surface people might think of as cutlasses. And in some senses, they do handle similarly, but there are definitely some notable differences. So at a later date, we will probably talk about the Dutch claywang. If you're interested, please leave a like, leave a share, maybe say that in the comments, and yeah, we can come back to that. So we'll talk about the claywang at another time. So Alex, I'll turn this over to you. What sorts of things would you point out here?
So the first thing that we're going to look at here is, first thing that I want to talk about here is weight. This weighs about 1.3 kilograms, or 2 pounds 14 ounces, which is actually on the heavier side for a historic sword. That's something that I think is very important to understand, that people think swords, they often think heavy, which is just not the case. In fact, this 1.3 kilograms, there are plenty of long swords that fall in that weight parameter, or even lighter. I actually find sabers tend to be a little on the heavier side relative to swords, partially because of the extra hilting material, but also because often they're designed for cavalry use. So you don't need to be accelerating them purely from the arm as much, and you're using the power of, well, a horse. So the first point that I want to look at here is, I find that something I find fascinating is the engravings on this piece. If we look at the engravings on this pommel, they're some of them are pretty clean, and others are rather sloppy. And this extends to, you have these beautifully carved lines in the guard through the skeletonizing decoration. And again, up here you've got these leaves, which one of them is notably sloppier than the other. Now, this is just guesswork, but I think that realistically, there's two, maybe three reasons that you would see this kind of inconsistency. Number one might be that the maker was running out of time, so he rushed through part of the process. Another one is that it could have been started by a master or a journeyman of a shop and then was handed off to an apprentice to finish who didn't do as good of a job. And the final option is potentially that, you know, maybe at some point some repair work was done that caused the engraving to be distorted, that then somebody tried to fix, that were not as good as the original craftsman. I think that last one is the least likely, because there's not really signs of things having been like broken off of this before, but it's always possibilities to keep in mind. The next thing that I want to point out, and this is a very big thing when it comes to the trying to get a rough estimate. You know, I am not a certified archaeologist. I do not have the ability to carve in date, but I do know about the construction methodologies that were used in various eras. And if we look up towards the tip of this blade, one thing that we can see up here, it's right here, we can see what's called delamination. Delamination is a sign that, well, this is a laminate construction in terms of the blade. And that's right here, is that delamination. If you've ever watched Forged in Fire, they'll talk about delamination in regards to Sanmai or Damascus. Well, those laminate constructions were used a lot throughout the High Middle Ages, because hardenable steel was a precious resource. So you wanted to, so if you didn't have enough to forge an entire blade out, which most people didn't, and that includes very wealthy nobility, then you'd take, you know, a harder center and then probably some kind of a more middle hardenable steel, layer them together. Something similar to what you would call today a sanmai or a gomai. But that delamination there tells me, like I said, that this had to have been a laminate steel. And the fact that it's not, acid etched to show off the different layers of different materials, that's heavily indicative to me anyway, of this being properly from the late 1600s, as Jeff talked about earlier. As Jeff's going over the blade, I think it's worth talking about some of the damage that we see on this blade, where we see edge marks.
Yep, definitely notches in there.
Notches that very much look like they could have come from distinct edge-to-edge contact, especially within that sweet spot of the blade's cutting edge. And this chip right here by my thumbnail that, to be completely honest, looks like the right profile to have chipped on bone. So that, begs the question that was this used as a dueling weapon? Because that edge to edge gives some indication of that to me. There's one final piece of evidence towards that, which is if we go back to our pommel here, if we look at, this is what's called a peen plate. This is something that's missed on a lot of modern reproductions, is that there was a little plate put between the end of the tang that was peened over to create a mechanical connection and the pommel. This is so that if you need to pull off or replace anything in your hilt, you don't have to remove material from your pommel in order to grind off that peen, remove that mechanical connection. On this peen plate, there is a crack and some deformation. Now that could absolutely have come during the peening process or anywhere on the line, but it's also more to the outside, and this peen is very clean. Speaking as somebody who has done a lot of peens, yeah, go laugh at that comment, who has done a lot of peening, that's a very clean peen, and to have that a misstrike on the outside. But if somebody, for example, if I were to grab this in a proper grip here, to strike with that pommel against the curved slope of a skull or even a helmet, that's more of the
kind of effect you would expect.
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting.
Now that gets us to, so that paints a really interesting story with this sword. Was this used in a duel? It does, like I said, it does appear from what I can see to be constructed in a way in keeping with that time period, and that the way that the damage manifests definitely seems consistent with what we would see along blades in HEMA that you see getting successfully used. That those edge-to-edge contact in the sweet spot, implying that attack, that seems in keeping with there. But there's a problem with doing this kind of analysis, is that I can look at that and go, yeah, that's what that damage looks like it came from, which might be true, but we have no way of telling when that damage occurred. We can't date damage unless it's fresh, right, where we can say, okay, that's it. Like, let's say this sword is from 1690. This could have come from 1692, right. Or it could have come from 1876 or even 1920. There's no way to differentiate that. So I can look at this and try to extrapolate and paint a story of the life of the sword, and I might be accurate, but I might be wrong in when it took place. Yeah. And that's an important thing to remember with any kind of analysis that you're doing just based on sighting. Before we kind of wrap this all up, a couple other things that I want to talk about, and Jeff mentioned this earlier during our intro. Distal taper. When we're talking about distal taper, that's the difference in thickness between the bottom and the tip. And obviously taper flows. So this actually has a less aggressive distal taper than I've seen in a lot of the historic examples that I've had the privilege to handle. And it actually has a thinner spine despite being a heavier piece. Another part of that is the style of bevel on here. And when bladesmiths and blade makers or cutlers talk about beveling, there's different kinds of bevels. What's fascinating to me about this one is that this is pretty close to what I would think of as an axe grind. A very aggressive, obtuse bevel right at the edge of the blade. These kind of bevels are really good for chopping. They are not as good for slicing or any kind of finesse cutting. They tend to chop, like I said, chop through things, dig in, but they'll bind up when you try to get that slide and that draw. So that there's very specific reasons. Now, what's interesting up here is on the false edge is that this false edge is it's not sharp, but it is sharp enough that you can absolutely cause some damage there. That's another thing, that the whole term of false edge tends to be a little bit of a misnomer, where in a lot of modern stuff, false edges are dull but look like they're beveled, where in period they tend to be maybe not the same bevel or as sharp, but they can still cut. Again, that is, I can run my thumb gently against it, but I wouldn't want to be chopped by that. That would definitely
from my experience, it's definitely sharper than in the front.
But the thing that's interesting here is that this is a what I would call an appleseed bevel, where it has a bit of a curvature. A bit of a convex. There's a convex grind there. That convex grind is really good for longevity and durability compared to this aggressive axe grind. The convex grind actually will need to be sharpened less often in order to maintain its edge, but it's tough to get it as ultimately sharp in the end. So this might have been. It's also a more complex process to put that curvature, that convex angle in there, especially when you don't have a modern belt grinder to do it. Though they were really clever with what they did have, and I think that people underestimate that a lot. Fun fact, the earliest water-driven treadle hammers, so basically proto-power hammers that appear in Western Europe, are 13th century. So that's a lot longer than most people. So when people say, oh, you've got to do it, the old way, like they did in the Middle Ages with a hand hammer, it's like, anyway. But anyway, that's some of the things that I wanted to go over on this. I mean, there is a maker's mark here. I haven't studied up on maker's mark specifically. I study a lot of historic pieces. I look at a lot of their specs. I've handled a number of them. I don't know whose maker's mark that is. If somebody does, drop in the comments. Let us know.
Exactly. Yep. So there's maybe to finish up, there's always more to learn. And so I imagine, wherever this piece continues its journey, we'll probably still be able to find out more things about it down the line as more people get a chance to look at it, study it, and, learn more about history, which to me, that's the fun of HEMA. So, this has been Jeff and Alex from Forte, and hopefully we'll come back at another date with other fun toys to look at that could be both antique arms, but also potentially some rare books in the future. So again, this is kind of stuff that you'd like to see. Drop us a like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments.